In the rural village of Mvetso, South Africa, in 1918, a boy was born into the Thembu royal family of the Xhosa people. His name? Rolihlahla Mandela. A name that, in Xhosa, means pulling the branch of a tree, or more commonly translated, troublemaker. Fitting, isn't it? Little did the world know that this boy, born into a humble family in the rolling hills of the Eastern Cape, would one day shake the foundation of an entire nation. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniiswa, was a respected chief and a counselor to the Thembu king. He was a man of principle, one who would rather lose everything than betray his beliefs. And as fate would have it, he did point one day, after defying an order from a British colonial magistrate, Gadla was stripped of his chieftaincy. His lands, wealth, and power were taken away. But he refused to bow. His young son, watching from the shadows, learned a valuable lesson: a man's dignity is worth more than his wealth. And so, Mandela's journey began, not as a prince, but as a child of hardship, raised by a father who chose honor over comfort. The tribal traditions that shaped his mind. Mandela's childhood was filled with stories, tales of great warriors, wise chiefs, and the deep-rooted traditions of the Xhosa people. Every night, the elders of the village gathered around the fire, passing down their knowledge through oral storytelling. A warrior does not fight because he loves war, an elder once said, his voice deep and steady. He fights because his people need him. The young Mandela absorbed every word. During the day, he ran through the fields, herding cattle, and learning the ways of his ancestors. He was taught that leadership was not about power, but about service to the people. He listened as the elders spoke of the great resistance of the Xhosa against British and Dutch colonizers. The wars had been brutal. Many had died. And yet, the Xhosa people still stood tall. Never forget, his father told him one evening, a chief is not a ruler. He is a servant of his people. These words would stay with him forever. The death that changed everything in 1927, when Mandela was just 9 years old, his father fell ill and passed away. The loss shattered him. His father had been his protector, his guide, his hero. Without him, life felt uncertain, but fate had other plans. As per his father's wishes, Mandela was sent to the great place in Mkhekezweni, the royal palace of the Thembu people. There, he would be raised by the acting regent, Chief Jongintaba Dalindyebo. This was a turning point in his life. Though he was no longer living with his biological family, the regent took him in as a son, giving him access to an elite education and exposure to leadership. For the first time, Mandela saw a different world, one where decisions shaped nations, where power was not just about tradition, but also about governance. He realized something: if he wanted to make a difference, he would need more than courage. He would need knowledge. And so, he embraced learning, the education that opened his eyes. Mandela excelled in school. He attended Clarkberry Boarding Institute, one of the few institutions that provided education to black students. It was here that he was introduced to Western-style learning for the first time. He read about democracy, law, and civil rights, concepts that fascinated him. All men are created equal, one textbook read. Mandela frowned. If this was true, why did South Africa operate under a system where black people were treated as second-class citizens? The contradictions disturbed him. At Healdtown College, a Methodist school, he was introduced to the teachings of African nationalism, the idea that Africa belonged to its people, not the colonizers who ruled over it. The fire inside him grew. But his destiny was still uncertain. As a royal family member, tradition dictated that he should become a chief, serving as a political leader within the tribal system. However, deep in his heart, he knew he was meant for something else. Something much bigger. The first act of defiance, choosing his own path. As per tradition, the regent arranged a marriage for Mandela. He was to marry a woman chosen for him, a noble match that would ensure his place in Thembu leadership. But Mandela refused. "I will not be forced into a life I did not choose," he declared. It was a dangerous move. To defy the regent was to defy the very system that had raised him. But Mandela knew that his path lay elsewhere. And so, in 1941, at the age of 23, he and his cousin Justice fled to Johannesburg, the bustling heart of South Africa. This was it. The moment that changed everything. For the first time, Mandela left the familiarity of tribal life and stepped into a world controlled by the white minority. A world where apartheid was law. A world where he was not a prince, but a second-class citizen. The city was a boiling pot of injustice. Black workers labored in gold mines for pennies. Past laws restricted their movement. Police patrolled the streets, ready to arrest anyone without a permit. Mandela saw firsthand the cruelty of apartheid, and he knew he could never return to a life of silent obedience. His new journey had begun. The first steps into activism to survive in Johannesburg, Mandela took on odd jobs, security guard, clerk, and messenger, but he wanted more. He enrolled at Witwatersrand University, the only black student in the law faculty. It was here that he met activists, thinkers, and future revolutionaries. Among them was Walter Sisulu, a real estate agent with deep political ties. Sisulu saw something in Mandela: charisma, intelligence, and an unshakable spirit. "You could be great," Sisulu told him one day. "But you must decide what kind of man you want to be." That moment sealed his fate. Mandela joined the African National Congress, ANC, a political organization fighting against apartheid. At first, he believed in peaceful resistance. He studied the methods of Mahatma Gandhi, who had led India to independence through non-violent protest, but South Africa was not India. The government responded to peaceful protests with bullets, arrests, and massacres. Mandela realized words alone would not bring freedom, and so, the young lawyer became a revolutionary. A man who would soon be known not just as Nelson Mandela, but as the leader who dared to challenge a nation. If your fate was decided for you, would you accept it or fight back? Drop your answer in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for Episode 2. Episode 2, The Fight Against Apartheid. The battle for freedom begins in the system that enslaved a nation. The South Africa that Nelson Mandela stepped into was not just a country, it was a prison with invisible walls. For centuries, the white minority had ruled over the black majority with an iron fist. But in 1948, things took a darker turn. The government passed the apartheid laws, legally dividing the country by race. Black people were forbidden from living in white areas. They were forced to carry passbooks to prove they had permission to exist in certain spaces. They were banned from voting, owning land, or getting quality education. And if they dared to resist? Prison, beatings, even death. The system was so brutal that even in their own land, black South Africans were treated as foreigners. Nelson Mandela saw it firsthand. And he made a decision: he would not just live in this world. He would change it. This was the moment he stepped onto the path of revolution. The lawyer who fought the system. By 1952, Mandela had become a lawyer, opening the first black law firm in South Africa with his friend Oliver Tambo. Their mission? To defend the oppressed. From morning till night, their office was packed with people seeking justice. A man arrested for not carrying a passbook. A woman evicted from her home because of the color of her skin. A worker beaten for daring to ask for fair wages. Every case revealed the same truth: the law was not made to protect them. It was made to control them. One day, a desperate woman clutched Mandela's arm. "Mr. Mandela," she whispered, "will we ever be free?" Mandela clenched his fists. He had spent years trying to change things through legal means. But the law was written by the oppressors. It was time for something more, something bigger. The ANC and the Defiance Campaign. In 1952, the African National Congress, ANC, launched the Defiance Campaign, a mass movement of non-violent resistance. Mandela became one of its leaders. Their strategy? Civil disobedience. Thousands of people refused to carry passbooks. They entered whites-only areas in protest. They boycotted businesses that supported apartheid. At first, it seemed to be working, But then the government responded the only way they knew how, with violence. Protesters were arrested in droves, including Mandela himself. Police used whips, clubs, and bullets to crush demonstrations. Leaders were banned from speaking in public. The message was clear: peaceful protests alone would not be enough. Mandela had once believed in non-violence, but now, he started to wonder, if the enemy only speaks in violence, do we answer in silence? A storm was brewing. The treason trial, a fight in the courts in 1956, Mandela and 156 other leaders were arrested for treason, their crime? Fighting for freedom. The trial lasted 5 years, 5 years of intimidation, threats, and legal battles, but Mandela was no ordinary defendant. He turned the courtroom into a battlefield. "We are accused of seeking to overthrow the government," he declared, his voice echoing through the hall. "But we only seek to overthrow injustice." The world took notice. And in 1961, after years of trials, Mandela and his comrades were found not guilty. For a moment, they had won. But outside the courtroom, South Africa was burning. Something terrible was about to happen, something that would change Mandela forever. The Sharpeville Massacre, the day everything changed. On March 21, 1960, thousands of unarmed black protesters gathered in the town of Sharpeville. They marched to protest past laws, standing outside a police station, demanding their right to exist. Then, the police opened fire. 69 people were killed. 180 were wounded, many were shot in the back as they tried to flee. The massacre shook the world. And it shattered Mandela's belief in peaceful protest. "We cannot negotiate with a government that massacres unarmed people," he said. "The time for talking is over." And so, Nelson Mandela changed his strategy. He embraced armed resistance. The birth of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation. In 1961, Mandela co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation. It was the armed wing of the ANC, dedicated to sabotage and guerrilla warfare. They didn't target people, only government buildings, military installations, and power stations. Their goal? To make the country ungovernable. Mandela went underground, moving from safe house to safe house, disguising himself as a worker, a driver, even a chef. He became South Africa's most wanted man. The newspapers called him the Black Pimpernel, because no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't catch him. But the government was closing in. And soon, his luck would run out. The arrest, captured at last on August 5, 1962, after 17 months on the run, Mandela was captured. Betrayed by an informant, he was arrested near Howick, KwaZulu-Natal.in court. The judge asked him, "Do you plead guilty?" Mandela stood tall. "I do not recognize this court," he said, "because this court does not recognize my people." He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but the government wasn't done with him yet. They wanted him gone. And soon, they would silence him forever. Or so they thought. Would you fight back if you were in Mandela's position? Or would you accept the system and survive? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for episode 3. 3. The 27 years in prison, a lifetime in chains, a nation in waiting. Introduction. The man they couldn't break. 27 years. That's how long Nelson Mandela spent behind bars. 9,855 days. 236,520 hours. A lifetime for some. A sentence meant to break a man. But Mandela wasn't an ordinary man. They could lock his body in a cell, but his spirit? That was unstoppable. This is the story of a prisoner who refused to kneel. The story of the man who changed the world without ever leaving his tiny cell. Robben Island, the hellhole of apartheid. After his 1964 trial, Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to Robben Island, South Africa's most brutal prison. The moment he stepped onto that cold, desolate rock, he knew this was meant to be his grave. Prisoners at Robben Island were treated worse than animals. They slept on thin mats on cold stone floors. Their meals were a handful of corn porridge, twice a day. Their uniforms were shorts, even in freezing winter. And their work? Breaking rocks under the burning African sun. Mandela and the other political prisoners were given the hardest labor. For hours, they hammered limestone, the blinding white dust burning their eyes until they could barely see. It was designed to crush their bodies and their will. But Mandela refused to break. One day, a young guard mocked him. "You will die here, Mandela." Mandela simply smiled and said, "That is not for you to decide." Even in chains, he was still free. The secret university, turning prison into a school. If the government thought prison would silence him, they were wrong. Mandela turned Robben Island into a university. The guards called it Mandela School. He taught young prisoners law, politics, and philosophy. He smuggled in books and newspapers. He turned his tiny cell into a classroom. Even the hardened criminals began calling him Tata, Father. Mandela believed that knowledge was the greatest weapon. One day, he told them, "We will not just be prisoners. We will be leaders. And we must be ready." He was preparing a generation, even from behind bars. The battle with the guards, fighting without fists. The guards hated Mandela. They called him Black Pimpernel. They tried everything to break him. They denied him food. They refused to let him see his family. They threw him into solitary confinement for weeks. But Mandela had learned something powerful. Dignity is a weapon. He never begged. He never raged. He never let them see his fear. One day, a particularly cruel guard spat at him. "You're nothing, Mandela. Nothing but a prisoner." Mandela simply wiped his face and smiled. "And yet," he said, "you are the one who is afraid." Even the guards began to respect him. One of them later admitted, "We locked up a man. But somehow, he became our leader." The world takes notice. The Free Mandela movement. While Mandela was in prison, his name became a legend. The world had not forgotten him. In the 1980s, the anti-apartheid movement exploded. Countries imposed sanctions on South Africa. Celebrities, politicians, and activists demanded his release. The song "Free Nelson Mandela" became an anthem of resistance. The South African government was under pressure. They offered Mandela a deal: "If you renounce violence, we will set you free." Mandela replied, "Only a free man can negotiate. I am not free." He refused. He would not leave prison until his people were free too. Victor Verster Prison, the final years behind bars in 1988. After 26 years in brutal conditions, Mandela was moved to Victor Verster Prison, a more comfortable facility. The government hoped to quiet the protests by treating him better, but it was too late. The world was demanding change. South Africa was on the edge of collapse. Riots filled the streets. The economy was crumbling under international sanctions. Even white South Africans wanted change. The government had no choice, they had to negotiate. And the only man who could save the country was still behind bars. The day freedom came. Mandela walks free after 27 years. The moment had arrived. Nelson Mandela was free. The world held its breath. Would he call for revenge? Would he incite a war? No. Mandela preached peace. "I have walked that long road to freedom," he told the crowd. "But I have discovered that the greatest weapon is not violence, it is forgiveness." South Africa had a choice: bloodshed or reconciliation. And because of Mandela, they chose a new beginning. If you were in Mandela's shoes, would you have forgiven your captors? Or would you have sought revenge? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for episode 4. Episode 4, The Path to Presidency: The Journey from Prisoner to Nation's Leader. Introduction. The road to freedom is not over. Freedom. For 27 years, Nelson Mandela dreamed of this moment. But as he stepped out of prison on February 11, 1990, he knew his battle had just begun. South Africa was a nation on fire. The streets were filled with riots. The economy was crumbling. Racial tensions were at a boiling point. Some wanted revenge. Others wanted war. But Mandela? He wanted peace. This is the incredible journey of how a prisoner became a president and how he saved a nation from destruction. The chaos of a divided nation, South Africa in 1990, was a ticking time bomb. Apartheid might have been crumbling, but its scars ran deep. Black South Africans were angry. Decades of oppression, poverty, and brutality had built up rage. White South Africans feared losing power. Some were ready to fight to keep apartheid alive. The government was split. Some wanted reform, others wanted Mandela dead. The world held its breath. Would South Africa erupt into civil war? Or would Mandela find a way to unite the broken pieces? The answer lay in his next move, negotiating with the enemy. The de Klerk meetings. Mandela knew that war would destroy South Africa. He had only one choice: negotiate with his former enemies. His main opponent? F.W. de Klerk, the President of South Africa. De Klerk was a white Afrikaner, born into a world of privilege. He had once defended apartheid, but now he saw it was unsustainable. He had the power to keep Mandela locked away forever, but he also had the power to end apartheid. Their first meeting was icy. "Mr. Mandela, are you willing to compromise?" de Klerk asked. Mandela leaned forward. "I have spent 27 years in a cell. Do you think I fear compromise?" But peace was not easy. Radical groups on both sides wanted violence. Talks broke down multiple times, sometimes over a single word. Mandela received death threats, some even from his own supporters. Still, he pushed forward. "If we do not end apartheid through words, we will end it through blood. And I refuse to spill blood." Slowly, after hundreds of hours of negotiations, a fragile agreement was reached: apartheid would end. For the first time in history, South Africans of all races would vote. The election date was set, April 27, 1994. But there was one final test. The assassination of Chris Hani, a nation on the brink of war. Just when South Africa seemed close to peace, tragedy struck. Chris Hani, a popular black leader and Mandela's ally, was assassinated by a white extremist. The country exploded in anger. Riots broke out. People demanded blood. Even Mandela's closest supporters urged revenge. This was the breaking point. If Mandela could not calm the nation, war would be inevitable. That night, Mandela went on national television. "To those who seek revenge, I say, we must not become what we fight against. We can destroy this country in anger, or we can build it in unity." His words were like water on fire. The riots slowed. The country stepped back from the edge. Mandela had done the impossible. He had stopped a war with words. But now, he had to win an election. The historic 1994 election, the people's choice. For the first time in history, every South African had a voice. Some had waited their whole lives for this moment. Even former prisoners, now old and frail, stood in line for hours, just to place a simple X on a ballot paper. By nightfall, the results were clear. Nelson Mandela had won. He was now the first black president of South Africa. The same country that had once locked him in a cell was now handing him the keys to power. Mandela's inauguration: "A new era begins, and never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will experience the oppression of one by another. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement." And with those words, South Africa was reborn. A leader who chose unity over revenge. Most new leaders punish their enemies. But not Mandela. He forgave those who imprisoned him. He worked with his former oppressors. He even invited his former jailer to his inauguration. His most powerful decision was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Instead of trials and executions, South Africa would heal through truth. Victims would tell their stories. Perpetrators would confess their crimes. And instead of revenge, there would be forgiveness. The world watched in shock. How could a man who had suffered so much choose peace over payback? But Mandela knew, if we do not forgive, we will never be free. Conclusion: the legacy of a true leader. Mandela only served one term as president. Why? Because true leaders do not seek power, they serve the people. When he stepped down in 1999, he left behind a united South Africa. A country that had defeated hate with love. A world that had witnessed the power of forgiveness. When he passed away in 2013, the world mourned. But his legacy, that lives forever. A prisoner who became a president. A leader who chose peace over revenge. A man who changed the world, with nothing but courage. What do you think was Mandela's greatest act of leadership? His resistance, his forgiveness, or his presidency? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Episode 5, Mandela's Legacy, the man beyond the legend. A man may leave the world, but his impact lingers far beyond his years. Nelson Mandela was more than just a political leader, he was a symbol of hope, unity, and resilience. His story did not end when he stepped down from office, nor did his influence fade when he took his last breath. This is the tale of the man behind the legend, the global icon whose spirit continues to inspire generations. The power of forgiveness. After spending 27 years in prison, many expected Mandela to seek revenge. But instead of wielding power as a weapon, he used it to unite a broken nation. One of his most iconic actions was forming the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, a platform where the victims and perpetrators of apartheid could speak their truth and seek forgiveness. When asked why he chose forgiveness over revenge, Mandela once said, "Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies." He knew that bitterness would only divide South Africa further. His belief in reconciliation became a cornerstone of his leadership, proving that true strength lies in the ability to forgive. But forgiveness was not always easy. Many black South Africans felt betrayed, questioning why Mandela was willing to work alongside the same people who had once oppressed them. It took time for the country to heal, but his message remained clear: we were not born to hate. If we can learn to hate, we can be taught to love. Can you imagine being locked away for nearly 3 decades and then shaking hands with your captors? That was the kind of leader Mandela was. A global symbol of peace. Mandela's influence extended far beyond South Africa. He became a symbol of peace worldwide, advocating for human rights, education, and democracy. In 1993, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, sharing it with former President F.W. de Klerk, the very man he once opposed. The world took notice. Leaders across the globe sought his wisdom, and his words resonated with people from all walks of life. When asked about leadership, he said, "A leader is like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they are being directed from behind." Mandela did not just tell people how to lead, he showed them through his actions. His life became a blueprint for leadership, integrity, and humility. One of his greatest contributions to humanity was his fight against poverty and inequality. He once said, "Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity, it is an act of justice." Even after stepping down as president, he continued working tirelessly to improve education and healthcare in Africa. The Nelson Mandela Foundation was established to continue his humanitarian work, ensuring that his fight for equality lived on. The final years, a humble icon. Despite being one of the most respected figures in history, Mandela never let power corrupt him. Unlike many leaders who cling to authority, he served only one term and gracefully stepped down in 1999. "I have walked that long road to freedom, but I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibility," he said in his memoir. In his later years, Mandela focused on his family and personal life. He remained deeply connected to his Xhosa heritage, often visiting his childhood village in Cornu, where he found peace. Yet, even in retirement, the world still called upon him. Presidents, celebrities, and activists visited him for advice. He became a father figure to global leaders, guiding them with his wisdom. But despite the fame, he remained humble. He often joked, saying, "I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." Even at the height of his legacy, he never saw himself as perfect. He was a man who had made mistakes, struggled with personal relationships, and felt the weight of his choices. But he never let those struggles define him. The world mourns. December 5, 2013. Then, on December 5, 2013, the world came to a standstill. Nelson Mandela had passed away at the age of 95. Leaders from over 100 countries attended his funeral, a gathering unlike any seen before. His coffin, draped in the South African flag, was carried through the streets as millions lined up to say their final goodbyes. Former US President Barack Obama spoke at the memorial, saying, "He no longer belongs to us, he belongs to the ages." But Mandela's death did not mark the end of his story. It was merely a new chapter, one where the world carried his message forward. South Africa declared December 5 as a day of national mourning, but more than that, his birthday, July 18, became Nelson Mandela International Day. Every year, people are encouraged to spend 67 minutes doing acts of kindness, 1 minute for each year of Mandela's public service. The lessons he left behind. Mandela's life was filled with hardship, sacrifice, and loss, but through it all, he never gave up on his vision for a better world. Here are some of the most powerful lessons he left us. 1. Leadership is about service, not power. He did not seek the presidency for personal gain, but to heal a nation. He proved that great leaders do not cling to power, they empower others. 2. Forgiveness is the ultimate strength. Courageous people do not fear forgiving, for the sake of peace, he once said. Holding on to anger only chains us to the past. 3. Education is the most powerful weapon. Mandela believed that the key to changing the world was through knowledge. His dedication to education inspired countless initiatives to provide schooling for underprivileged children. For no one is born hating another person. He taught us that racism and division are learned behaviors, which means they can be unlearned. We have the power to create unity. 5. Persistence always triumphs over oppression. If Mandela could survive 27 years in prison and still emerge with hope, what excuse do we have to give up? He proved that no struggle is too great when fought with patience and purpose.